There is a street corner in the city of Sarajevo that a purple banner now calls the street corner that started the 20th century. It is an unremarkable place, a narrow intersection beside a river, a stone bridge at one end, a small museum on the corner. On most days, ordinary people walk past it without a second glance. But on the morning of June 28, 1914, this intersection became the hinge point on which all of modern history turned. 2 shots were fired here, 2 people died within the hour, and within 6 weeks, 20 million more would begin the long process of dying across the fields and trenches of a Europe that none of them had asked to inherit. The story of how 2 pistol shots on a summer morning in Bosnia ignited the largest war the world had ever seen is not simply a story of assassination and retaliation. It is a story of choices, a cascade of decisions made by men with limited information, consuming ambitions, and a catastrophic inability to see where each step was leading. And at the center of that cascade, made in a garden pavilion in Potsdam, over lunch on July 5, 1914, stands the decision that made everything else possible. The Kaiser's gamble, the blank check that no one could cash without burning the continent. But to understand that decision, to understand why a man would write such a check, and why the men around him would countersign it, you must understand how Europe arrived at the summer of 1914. You must understand the world that Bismarck built and the world that Wilhelm unmade. You must walk the path that leads from the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles in 1871, where the German Empire was born in triumph. Go to that garden in Potsdam 43 years later, where it signed its own death warrant with a handshake and a promise of unconditional support. In 1871, when Otto von Bismarck proclaimed the German Empire in the palace of the defeated French kings, the map of Europe shifted in ways that would take decades to fully register. A new great power had appeared at the center of the continent, not the Prussia of Frederick the Great, a medium-sized kingdom of military discipline and limited ambition, but a unified Germany of 60 million people, the largest industrial economy on the continent, the most powerful army in the world, and a chancellor whose strategic intelligence was without equal in the chancelleries of Europe. Bismarck understood something that most of his contemporaries did not. Where Germany's position in 1871 was simultaneously one of strength and of extreme fragility. The empire had been born through wars against Austria and France. Austria had been humiliated but not destroyed, and retained its great power status and its deep connection to the German-speaking world. France had been defeated, stripped of Alsace and Lorraine, and forced to pay an enormous indemnity. And France would never forgive any of it. The Franco-Prussian War had not ended France's enmity. It had crystallized it. France would wait, rebuild, and seek revenge. That was not a question. The question was whether France would find allies powerful enough to act on that enmity. To prevent that alliance was the central project of Bismarck's foreign policy for the next 20 years. His system of alliances, the Three Emperors League, if the dual alliance with Austria-Hungary, the secret reinsurance treaty with Russia, was not designed to expand German power. It was designed to protect what Germany already had. France must always be isolated. Russia must always have more to gain from friendship with Germany than from alliance with France. Austria-Hungary must be managed rather than encouraged. Britain must be given no reason to involve itself. It was a system of extraordinary complexity, held together by Bismarck's singular ability to hold contradictions in alignment. To be, simultaneously, Russia's friend and Austria's ally, even when those two powers had conflicting interests in the Balkans. And it worked. For 2 decades, Europe remained at peace. Crises came and went. The Eastern question flared repeatedly. The Balkans simmered with the constant threat of nationalist violence. Colonial rivalries produced friction among all the major powers. But none of it became a general European war because Bismarck was always at the center of the web, always pulling the right thread at the right moment, always ensuring that no combination of powers had both the will and the opportunity to challenge the German Empire. Then Wilhelm II became Kaiser, and then Bismarck was gone, and then the web began to unravel. The young Kaiser, who dismissed his chancellor in March of 1890, was 29 years old, brilliant in flashes, constitutionally incapable of patience, and convinced, with the absolute certainty of a deeply insecure man, that his own judgment was superior to that of everyone around him. And his first act of consequence in foreign policy was to allow the reinsurance treaty with Russia to lapse in June 1890. His advisors told him the treaty was diplomatically inconsistent. He listened to them. Within 4 years, Russia had signed a military alliance with France. The isolation of France, the cornerstone of Bismarck's entire system, was over. What followed was a decade of accelerating miscalculations. The Kruger telegram of 1896, congratulating the Boer Republic for resisting British power, turned British public opinion against Germany with startling speed. The Tirpitz naval program, begun in 1897, transformed Britain from a cautious neutral into a determined strategic opponent. The Morocco crisis of 1905, in which the Kaiser sailed into Tangier harbor on a white horse to challenge French colonial authority, served only to accelerate the Anglo-French military partnership. The Daily Telegraph disaster of 1908, in which Wilhelm managed to offend every major power in Europe in a single published interview, shook confidence in German leadership even among Germany's own allies. By 1914, the diplomatic world that Bismarck had constructed no longer existed. In its place was something far simpler and far more dangerous. Two armed camps facing each other across a Europe wound as tight as a watch spring. On one side, the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, though Italy's reliability had long been suspect. On the other, the Triple Entente, France, Russia, and Britain, bound together not by a single formal military treaty, but by a dense network of agreements, understandings, and military staff talks that amounted, in practice, was to the same thing. Both camps understood that any major conflict could pull them all in. Both camps had been living with that understanding for years, managing crisis after crisis through nervous diplomacy. The Bosnian crisis of 1908, the Agadir crisis of 1911, the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913, each had brought Europe to the edge of the abyss, and each time, somehow, the men with their hands on the levers had pulled back. There was no guarantee they would pull back next time, and in certain chancelleries and general staffs, there were men who were no longer certain they wanted to. In Vienna, the Austrian Chief of Staff, Franz Conrad von Hötzendorf, had been urging preemptive war against Serbia for years. He understood that the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a patchwork of 11 nationalities, was a mosaic of languages and religions held together by bureaucracy and tradition rather than by any common identity, was being slowly undermined by the nationalism that was electrifying the Balkans. Serbia, riding high after its victories in the Balkan Wars, was the standard bearer of South Slavic nationalism. To many in Vienna, Serbia was not simply a rival, it was an existential threat. Every year that passed brought more Serbian prestige, more pan-Slavic agitation within Austria's own borders, more pressure on the fragile unity of the empire. Conrad had argued repeatedly and without success that the time to act was now, while Germany was still stronger than Russia, while Austria could still field an effective army, while the window of opportunity remained open. In Berlin, now the German military, Chief of Staff Helmuth von Moltke the Younger, War Minister Erich von Falkenhayn, had reached a similar conclusion through different reasoning. Russia's great military program, begun in 1913, was scheduled for completion by 1917. When it was finished, Russia would have an army of more than 2 million men, a force so large that the Schlieffen Plan, Germany's only operational strategy for a two-front war, might no longer work. The plan required Germany to knock France out of the war in 6 weeks, then transfer its forces east to deal with Russia before the Russian mobilization was complete. It was a plan built on precise timing, and that timing was vulnerable to Russia's expanding military capacity. In the words of General Moltke, if war was coming anyway, yes, a moment so favorable from the military point of view might never occur again. This was the atmosphere. The combination of Austrian desperation and German military pessimism about the future, into which the shots at Sarajevo fell on June 28, 1914. The morning begins beautifully. The city of Sarajevo is dressed for an imperial visit. The streets along the Appell Quay are lined with spectators. Flags hang from the windows of the ornate Austro-Hungarian buildings that have risen alongside the older Ottoman architecture of the city. The weather is warm, the sky clear. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary, and his wife Sophie have arrived for a military inspection, and this public motorcade through the city is both a demonstration of imperial authority and, in a small way, an act of love. Though Sophie is a commoner by Habsburg standards, a countess but not of sufficient rank to sit beside the Archduke at formal court functions. In his military capacity, however, the rigid Habsburg protocol relaxes, and here in Sarajevo, on this sunny Sunday morning, she can ride beside him in the open car as an equal. Thus, for love, as one historian would later write, did the Archduke go to his death. Along the route, 6 young men wait with bombs and pistols. They are members of Young Bosnia, a network of Bosnian Serb nationalists who have been trained and equipped with help from a Serbian military intelligence officer connected to the secret society known as the Black Hand. They are young, most of them students, underfed, burning with the conviction that Austria-Hungary's annexation of Bosnia 6 years earlier is an injustice that demands the ultimate response. Their target, the Archduke, is a man who represents the empire they despise. They do not know, could not know, that the man they are about to kill is actually one of the more moderate voices in Viennese politics, an advocate of federalism who has privately opposed the Hawks' urging preemptive war against Serbia. The first attempt fails almost comically. At shortly after 10 in the morning, a conspirator named Nedeljko Chabrinović hurls a hand grenade at the Archduke's open car. The grenade bounces off the folded-back convertible roof and explodes beneath the following vehicle, wounding several people and sending the motorcade racing toward the city hall. Chabrinović swallows his cyanide capsule and jumps into the Miljacka River. The cyanide is old and only makes him sick. The river is 6 inches deep. He breaks a leg and is pulled out and arrested, violently ill but very much alive. At the city hall, the Archduke delivers his speech, first furiously scratching out the prepared welcome address and snapping at the mayor, and then with the composure of a man trained from birth to perform under any circumstance, speaking to the assembled dignitaries as if nothing extraordinary has occurred. Afterward, he and Sophie return to the waiting motorcade. He has decided to visit the hospital to see the people wounded by the grenade. The route changes. No one tells the lead driver. At the corner of Franz Joseph Street and the Appell Quay, near the northern end of the Latin Bridge, the lead car turns right by mistake. A general shouts that the driver is going the wrong way. The driver brakes. The open car stops. It has stopped 4 feet from Gavrilo Princip, 19 years old, standing on the pavement with a sandwich he has just purchased from a shop, having given up on the morning and walked away from his position along the route. He has missed his opportunity. He knows it. And then, as if history itself cannot bear to let the moment pass without its consequence, the car stops directly in front of him. He steps forward. He fires twice. The first bullet strikes Sophie in the abdomen, severing a gastric artery. The second tears through the Archduke's jugular vein. As the car races toward the governor's residence, a stream of blood shoots from Franz Ferdinand's mouth. Sophie collapses against her husband. He whispers to her again and again, "Stay alive, Sophie, for the sake of the children." By the time the car arrives at the governor's palace, both of them are dying. Both will be dead within the hour. The news reaches European capitals in the hours that follow, arriving by telegraph into the quiet Sunday routines of foreign ministries and royal courts. Kaiser Wilhelm II receives it aboard his yacht, the Hohenzollern, in the Norwegian fjords. He has been cruising the northern waters, as is his summer custom, taking the distance from Berlin that the annual holiday provides. He is distressed, not merely politically but personally. He has met Franz Ferdinand. He liked him. The two had spoken at the Archduke's estate just 2 weeks before the assassination. Whatever complex calculations will follow, Wilhelm's first response is genuine grief. He returns to Berlin. The dispatches begin arriving. From Vienna, from German ambassadors across Europe, from German military commanders, and in their margins, in the cramped handwriting that will become historical evidence of a mind in motion, he begins to write. Now or never, we must finish with the Serbs quickly. The key figures in Vienna waste no time. The hawks who have been urging action for years understand immediately that Franz Ferdinand's death has handed them an opportunity that may not come again. The Archduke, ironically, had been one of the obstacles to their plans. He had understood that a war with Serbia risked bringing in Russia, and Russia could destroy the empire. With him gone, Foreign Minister Leopold von Berchtold and Conrad, the Chief of Staff, move quickly to shape the crisis into the pretext they have been waiting for. They will go to war with Serbia, but they know they cannot do it without Germany. If Russia intervenes to protect Serbia, and Russia, as the self-appointed protector of the Slavic peoples, almost certainly will, Austria-Hungary cannot fight both Serbia and Russia alone. They need to know what Germany will do. And so, on July 4th, Berchtold dispatches his chief of staff, Alexander von Hoyos, on a secret mission to Berlin. Hoyos carries 2 documents. One is a memorandum on the Balkan situation, emphasizing Austria-Hungary's view of the Serbian threat. The other is a personal handwritten letter from the elderly Emperor Franz Joseph to Kaiser Wilhelm II. The letter's message is stripped of its diplomatic circumlocution, is simple. Austria-Hungary is asking whether Germany will stand behind it, whatever it decides to do. Hoyos arrives in Berlin on the morning of July 5th. That afternoon, Austria-Hungary's ambassador to Germany, Count Zsogyen, is received for lunch by the Kaiser at the Neue Palais in Potsdam. It is a Sunday. The gardens are quiet. The 2 men eat in the pleasant formality of an imperial lunch. And then Zsogyen presents the documents from Vienna. Wilhelm reads them. He listens to Zsogyen explain what Vienna is contemplating. And then, with what one participant will describe as uncharacteristic decisiveness, for Wilhelm is not usually decisive, he tells the ambassador that Austria-Hungary can count on Germany's faithful support, even if Russia intervenes. Even if it comes to a general European war, Germany will stand with Austria-Hungary whatever action it chooses to take against Serbia. He says that he needs to confirm this with his chancellor, Bethmann Hollweg, but he makes clear what the answer will be. Austria-Hungary, he tells Zsogyen, should not allow the chance that is so favorable to them to go by without making use of it. That afternoon, at Potsdam, the Kaiser assembles a council. Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg, Foreign Secretary Zimmermann, War Minister Falkenhayn, the head of the military cabinet, senior naval officers. Every man in the room endorses the Kaiser's position. Bethmann Hollweg, for his part, has arrived at the meeting with his own calculations already made. He has told his aide Kurt Riesler 2 days earlier that action against Serbia can lead to a world war, and that such a leap in the dark is justified by the international situation. He believes that Russia may not be ready to fight. He believes that if Russia does not intervene, Germany has scored a major diplomatic victory. He believes that if Russia does intervene, better that the war happen in 1914 than in 1917, when the Russian military program will be complete and the window of German advantage will have closed. On July 6th, the formal confirmation goes to Vienna. Germany will support Austria-Hungary in whatever action it decides to take. The blank check has been written. Vienna does not move immediately, and this delay will later infuriate German strategists who had hoped for a quick strike that would present Europe with a fait accompli. Instead, Austrian leaders spend 2 weeks deliberating, arguing among themselves, and carefully constructing an ultimatum designed not to be accepted. They also wait for a specific reason. French President Poincaré and Prime Minister Viviani are visiting Tsar Nicholas II in St. Petersburg, and Vienna wants to time the delivery of the ultimatum to coincide with the departure of the French leaders, ensuring that France and Russia cannot coordinate their response in real time. The ultimatum is delivered to Belgrade at 6 in the evening on July 23rd. It is 48 hours long. Its terms are, as Berchtold has promised his German allies, composed so that the possibility of its acceptance is practically excluded. Serbia is told to suppress all anti-Austrian publications, to dissolve nationalist societies, to allow Austro-Hungarian officials to participate in the judicial investigation on Serbian soil, and to dismiss any Serbian officials that Austria-Hungary identifies. It is an ultimatum that strikes even neutral observers as designed to humiliate rather than resolve. As Winston Churchill, reading it in London, writes to his wife, "It is an ultimatum such as had never been penned in modern times." Serbia's response, delivered minutes before the deadline on July 25th, accepts all but one of the demands: the participation of Austrian officials in internal Serbian judicial proceedings, which Serbia correctly identifies as a violation of its sovereignty. It is, by any objective reading, a remarkably conciliatory reply from a country being told to surrender its independence. Even the Kaiser, who has rushed back from his Norwegian cruise and is now reading the documents in Berlin, looks at Serbia's reply and writes in the margin that there is no longer any justification for war, and that Austria-Hungary should content itself with a temporary occupation of Belgrade as a symbolic measure of enforcement. It is too late. The machine is already moving. Austria-Hungary has broken off diplomatic relations with Serbia on July 25th, the moment its ambassador read the Serbian reply. The military is mobilizing, and the German Foreign Office, which has been actively encouraging Vienna toward decisive action throughout the crisis, has sent communications to Berchtold that have already persuaded him to proceed. On July 27th, Emperor Franz Joseph authorizes war against Serbia. On July 28, 1914, exactly 1 month after the shots at the Latin Bridge, Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia. As Austrian artillery begins bombarding Belgrade across the Danube that night, the night sky over the Serbian capital lights up with the flash of shells, and the diplomatic mechanisms that might have stopped the war are overwhelmed by the military ones that are now in motion. Russia, which has been watching the crisis with gathering alarm, had begun initial mobilization preparations days earlier. Now Tsar Nicholas II authorizes general mobilization. It is a fateful decision, because in the planning of European militaries in 1914, mobilization and war are not clearly separated. Mobilizing millions of men, moving them to borders, concentrating them according to plans that have taken years to develop. All of this is not simply preparation for war. It is, in a military sense, the beginning of war. And for Germany, that Russian mobilization triggers the Schlieffen Plan. The Schlieffen Plan has been Germany's only operational strategy for a two-front war since 1905. It is built on a simple premise: Germany cannot fight France and Russia simultaneously along both frontiers without being ground to pieces. The solution is to fight them sequentially. Knock France out in 6 weeks with an overwhelming attack through neutral Belgium and Luxembourg, bypassing the French fortifications along the direct border. Then transfer the German armies east by rail before the Russian mobilization is complete, and defeat Russia in turn. The entire plan rests on speed and the neutrality of Belgium, a neutrality that has been guaranteed by a treaty signed by Prussia in 1839 and underwritten by all the great powers of Europe, including Britain. When Russia mobilizes, or Germany has no choice, or believes it has no choice, but to activate the Schlieffen Plan. On July 31st, Germany sends an ultimatum to Russia demanding it halt mobilization within 24 hours. On August 1st, receiving no reply, Germany declares war on Russia. On August 3rd, Germany declares war on France. On August 4th, German troops invade neutral Belgium. On the morning of August 4th, the British Foreign Secretary, Sir Edward Grey, addresses the House of Commons. He has spent weeks working for a diplomatic solution, sending proposals for mediation, urging restraint on all sides. None of it has mattered. The machinery of mobilization has overwhelmed the machinery of diplomacy. That evening, as the deadline for Britain's ultimatum to Germany over Belgian neutrality expires without a response, the British Empire enters the war. As Grey stands at his window in the Foreign Office watching the lamplighters working in the street below, he speaks what will become one of history's most famous sentences. He does not direct it to anyone in particular. He speaks it quietly to the darkening city, to no one and to everyone. The lamps are going out all over Europe. We shall not see them lit again in our lifetime. He is right. By the end of August 1914, all the major powers of Europe are at war. The mobilization of millions of men has proceeded with the mechanical precision of timetables worked out over years. Armies are moving on schedules that generals and politicians alike are now powerless to alter. The men going east and west and north and south on the troop trains of a dozen nations do not know, cannot know, that 4 years of industrial slaughter await them. They go with flowers in their rifles and songs on their lips, because every government has told them this will be over by Christmas. And because human beings going to war have always found it easier to believe they will be home soon. They will not be home soon. The Western Front will stabilize by November 1914 into a system of trenches that will barely move for 4 years. By the time it is over, in November 1918, approximately 20 million people will be dead. Empires will have fallen. German, Russian, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman. The map of Europe will have been redrawn. The social order of the pre-war world will be gone, replaced by something no one in that garden in Potsdam on July 5th could have imagined, much less intended. The question of who bears responsibility for this catastrophe has occupied historians ever since. In 1919, when the victorious Allies placed the entire guilt on Germany and its allies in the notorious war guilt clause of the Versailles Treaty, demanding reparations for a war they declared Germany had caused. The Germans spent the next 20 years arguing against this verdict, generating a mountain of counter-historical argument designed to distribute the blame more evenly. In the 1960s, the German historian Fritz Fischer reignited the controversy by arguing, with a wealth of documentary evidence, that Germany had deliberately sought a European war in 1914, using the Sarajevo assassination as a pretext for a war of continental expansion that its military and political leaders had been planning for years. In more recent decades, historians like Christopher Clark, writing in The Sleepwalkers, have pushed back against this emphasis on German responsibility, arguing that all the major powers bear a share of the blame, that the European leaders of 1914 stumbled into a war that none of them fully understood or controlled, like sleepwalkers walking calmly and assuredly toward a precipice in the dark. Others, like Annika Mombauer, have returned to the documentary evidence and argued that the blank check and the German encouragement of Austrian aggression throughout July makes German responsibility inescapable, even if others share portions of the guilt. What the documents show, assembled and examined across a century of scholarship, is this: the German leadership on July 5th and 6th made a decision knowing that it risked a general European war. They were not ignorant of the risk. Is Bethmann Hollweg had told his aide it could lead to world war. Moltke had told the Kaiser it might be the best moment for a preventive war. The blank check was not signed by men who believed a small Balkan conflict would stay small. It was signed by men who calculated, incorrectly as it turned out, that they could control what followed. They believed Russia would not fight. They believed France would not be ready. They believed Britain would stay neutral. They believed, in short, that they could win. They were wrong on every count. Russia fought. France was ready. Britain came in, and the Schlieffen Plan, which required knocking France out in 6 weeks, required more time than that and did not succeed. Germany ended 1914 with its armies deep inside France and Belgium, but unable to deliver the decisive blow the plan demanded. And dug into the eastern defenses against a Russian army that had not collapsed on schedule. The two-front war that Bismarck had called Germany's greatest nightmare was a reality by Christmas. But the question of responsibility is not merely academic. It matters because it connects to a deeper question, the question of how a world that had managed crisis after crisis for 40 years suddenly fell into a war of this scale. The answer is not a single cause. It is a convergence. The alliance system that divided Europe into two armed camps, each bound to defend the other's recklessness. The mobilization timetables that turned political decisions into military momentum too powerful to reverse. The nationalism that had inflamed populations from the Balkans to the Rhine. And the colonial rivalries that had poisoned relations between the great powers for a generation. The German naval expansion that had turned Britain from a neutral into an opponent. The Russian military program that had made the German generals feel the sand running through the hourglass. All of these forces were real, all of them contributed, but they were not sufficient by themselves. They created the conditions. The blank check pulled the trigger, because in the end, what the documents of July 1914 reveal is a moment of decision, a genuine fork in the road, at which different choices were possible. Vienna, without the German guarantee, would almost certainly not have issued the ultimatum in the form it did. The Austro-Hungarian leadership knew they risked bringing in Russia. What they needed to move forward was the assurance that Germany would bear that risk with them. The blank check provided that assurance. As one of the Austro-Hungarian participants would write after the war with startling candor, "We started the war, not the Germans, and even less the Entente. That I know, but they started it knowing they had Germany behind them. And they had Germany behind them because of a decision made over lunch in a garden pavilion on a July afternoon." Kaiser Wilhelm II spent the rest of his long life arguing that the war was not his fault. In his memoirs written in Dutch exile after 1918, he is encircled by enemies who misunderstood him, betrayed by advisors who deceived him, victimized by a diplomatic situation that gave him no choice. He writes of his love of peace, his efforts to restrain Austria. Here his famous Willy-Nicky telegrams to Tsar Nicholas, the last-minute personal messages between two cousins who called each other by diminutives while their armies mobilized against each other. He portrays himself as a man who saw what was coming and tried to stop it, only to be outmaneuvered by events beyond his control. The historical record treats these claims poorly. His marginal notes, preserved in the archives and published, tell a different story. Now or never, we must finish with the Serbs quickly. At the moment when the Serbian response came in, and even the Kaiser's own instincts recoiled at the prospect of war, it was too late. The machine he had helped set in motion could not be stopped. Bethmann Hollweg and the Foreign Office were already pushing Vienna forward. Moltke was already calculating that Liège must be taken by surprise if the Schlieffen Plan is to work. The decision of July 5th had its own logic, and that logic was running now on its own momentum. As the lights of Europe went out in August 1914, a generation was consumed by a war that its architects had imagined as limited, controlled, and rapid. It was none of these things. It was total, uncontrolled, and 4 years long. And in its wreckage, in the peace settlement at Versailles in 1919, the same palace where Bismarck had proclaimed German victory 48 years earlier, the humiliations imposed on Germany would plant the seeds of something worse. The war that the gamble of July 1914 began did not end in 1918. It paused. It resumed in 1939, and by the time it was truly over in 1945, the death toll had climbed to a number that defies human comprehension. All of it traces back through the chain of consequences to a street corner in Sarajevo and a garden in Potsdam, to a 19-year-old with a pistol and a bad sandwich, and to an emperor with a blank check and a catastrophic miscalculation about what the world would do when he signed it. The lamps went out in the summer of 1914, and when they came back on, the world they illuminated was not the one that had existed before. It was something new and harder and covered in the shadow of what had been lost. The pilots who might have navigated through the dark were gone, and the men left at the wheel did not know the waters they were sailing and drove the ship onto the rocks that those who came before them had always known were there.